The first trip I did to sea was on the Caronia for the coronation cruise which left New York. We sailed from Southampton, of course. 1953, the coronation. We picked up obviously very, very wealthy American passengers. Then I was transferred to the old Queen Mary. And the rather interesting story about the Queen Mary is the Cunard ships all ended in IA, like the Mauretania, Sylvania, Saxonia, etc. And all the White Star Line ships ended in IC, like the Titanic. And after the disaster of the Titanic, the government stepped in and basically forced the two companies to join together. And 534 was being built on John Brown stockyards. The then chairman of Cunard asked to see King George V, and he said, "Your Majesty, we would like to name 534, which is probably England's greatest ship, after England's great queen." And the king looked up and said, "My wife will be only too honoured." In actual fact, they meant to call it the Queen Victoria, and the name had to be changed. Now, the number of crew on the Queen Mary was about 1,200. Something like 93 chefs, for instance. Well, you had 3,000 odd passengers. You had tourist class, cabin class, and first class.
Welcome aboard the Queen Mary, where you served as a purser all those years ago for 6 months or so. Marvellous, marvellous ship. Look at the size of this ship. It's bigger than the Titanic even. A huge ship with over 2,000 passengers and hundreds of crew to attend to their every whim. The height of luxury. All the world's stars travelled on board this ship.
And the Duke of Windsor and the Duchess of Windsor travelled. I had to help the female secretary carry up the jewellery, which was in a very heavy steel box. And the Duke of Windsor came in from his bedroom, and I automatically stood up. And he said to me, "Well, how very kind of you to bring up her jewellery. Would you like a drink?" So I said, "Well, I'd love one, sir." So he said, "What would you like?" And I said, "Well, I'll have a gin and tonic, if I may, please, sir." My only claim to fame is that I've been poured a gin and tonic by an ex-king of England.
Look at the size of this ship. The funnels are huge. They're big enough to take 3 railroad trains side by side, if you laid them on their side. The ship itself, from one end to the other, is, I think, over 1,000 feet in length. It is a vast ship. It was the biggest ship in the world at one stage.
One of the pleasures of being senior assistant purser of the old Queen Elizabeth, one was able to meet the famous and the infamous. Lord Montgomery was one, Churchill was another, who travelled back from New York with us. And Cunard put one extra chef on board just for Churchill, because he would work all hours that God sent. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, he would suddenly say, "Right, that's it, I want to go to bed." Before he got into bed, he'd say, "I want duck à l'orange." And the chef was then called out to cook him duck à l'orange, and he had a half an hour's sleep, and he then got back into his siren suit, and the duck à l'orange was produced. There were 7 radio officers on board at the time, and 2 other radio officers were put on board purely and simply to cope with his signals he was sending to various presidents and prime ministers and things around the world. Then we had so many well-known people. Liberace used to travel, and passengers kept on asking us, try and persuade him to put on a show. We said we didn't think it was fair, that he was supposed to be on holiday. And I got so sick and tired of being asked that in the end I went up to his cabin and said to him, "Look, would you please put on a show?" And he said, "Well, I won't put a show on because I haven't got my candelabra." So I said, "Well, where is your candelabra?" And he said, "Well, it's down in the hole, in the suit, in a trunk." So I said, "Well, I'll see if we can get hold of this damn candelabra." And I got a hold of the bosun, and the bosun came back and said, "There's no hope in hell of finding it. There were hundreds and hundreds of trunks, and he couldn't move them all and didn't know which trunk it was in anyway." So I went back to Liberace, And I said, have you got a photograph of this candelabra? And he said, yes. So I borrowed it, and I took it down to the ship's confectioner, who was absolutely brilliant. And I said, can you copy this in sugar icing? And he said, of course I can. So he did it. I suddenly thought, candles. And I stole 5 or 6 candles from this synagogue, stuck them into this candelabra and took it up to his cabin and said, here's your damn candelabra, now will you play? And he said, well, I can't very well refuse, can I? And he put on one of the most magnificent performances I've ever seen in my life. And at the time, Noel Coward was travelling. He was up in the wardroom having a drink with the chief officer at the time. And I said to them, are you coming down to listen to Liberace? And they said no, they weren't. Noel Coward said it wasn't his scene at all. So I went down and listened to it, and I realized that it was something quite out of this world. Even I was impressed, and I can't usually stand that type of ostentatious performance. And he had a break, and I went back up to the wardroom and I said to the 2 of them, I don't care what you say, but you must come down. And we went back, and we had to stand on a table at the back. And it was a bit dicey with Noel Coward and the chief officer and myself all standing on the back. And at the end of the performance, Noel Coward turned to me and said, thank God you asked me down. He said, that was one of the most brilliant performances I've ever seen in my life.
Mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. The Japanese don't care to, the Chinese wouldn't dare to. Hindus and Argentines sleep firmly from 12 to 1, but Englishmen detesta, siesta.
I don't know why, but it became a ritual that I would go up to his cabin at about 5:30 every evening when he was on board, and we'd have a couple of gin and tonics together. I had a relation who had a sugar plantation in Jamaica, and I happened to say to him one day, oh, I shall be in Jamaica in a few weeks' time. He said, well, while you're there, he said, give me a call and I will send my driver and you must come over and have lunch with me. And I had the pleasure of going to Noel Coward's magnificent house. And he said, I've never been so nervous in all my life. And I said, why? He said, I have the Queen Mother coming for lunch next week. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, has tremendous personality. It oozes out of every pore, and she is an absolute darling. And unfortunately, I had to read the lesson at the church service. It was some ghastly thing from the Old Testament. It was something about Zebediah begets somebody and somebody else begets somebody else, and I couldn't pronounce the names. So I got hold of a vicar who was traveling, and I said to him, will you please come to my cabin and help me pronounce all these names? And he, in the end, he said to me, look, Peter, he said, you're so nervous about this, you're going to make a complete mess of it. He said, miss out the middle. Nobody will know. And the Queen Mother came in, sat in the front row. I got up and started reading from the lectern and said that the reading would be taken from whatever it was, I can't remember. And the Queen Mother, unfortunately, opened her Bible, and I thought, gosh, I'm going to have to read the whole damn thing. And I started off reasonably well. I made a complete mess up of the middle and ended up not too badly. After the reading, she was invited up to the wardroom, and I was halfway down the receiving line. And she came to me and said, oh, thank you very much for reading the lesson, Mr. Cleaver. Very kind of you. And then she quietly leant over and whispered in my ear, you meant to miss out the middle, didn't you? Which I thought was absolutely brilliant. And about 8 months later, I used to call at a friend's house in London, and I walked up and walked into the drawing room, and there was the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret. It appears that they just popped in for a drink on the way back from something to Clarence House, and she looked up and said, yes, Mr. Cleaver, you read the lesson at church, didn't you? And when you consider the number of thousands of people she meets, how she could remember, all I can think of is that I must have made such a complete mess of the readings that it even registered with her. At the time I was cabin purser, Benomino Gigli, the great opera singer of his time, was traveling, and numerous passengers asked me if he would sing in the cabin class because he had already done so in the first class. And I said it wasn't fair to ask him because he was on relaxed holiday. But I was pestered and pestered, and in the end I went up and asked him if he would do so. When he sang in the first class, the deck head is very high. In the cabin class lounge, it's much lower. And he came in with full voice. There was a small table with 4 liqueur glasses on it. And as he walked into the room, all 4 of those glasses shattered. And he saw it, and he realized he had to tone his voice down because of the lower deck head. And it was quite a fascinating experience, and he was a charming, charming gentleman as well. Elizabeth Taylor travelled with us on numerous occasions. Mike Todd was one of Elizabeth Taylor's husbands, and the bank was closed at the time, and he came up to the purser's office and with a $100 bill and asked me if I would change it to 2 $50 bills. I put the 2 $50 bills down on the counter, and he picked up one and walked away. I said to him, "Mr. Todd, you've left one of your $50 bills behind." He said, "Oh, that's for you, sonny, for the trouble you've gone to changing it." And I looked up and said, "Well, it's very kind of you, Mr. Todd, but I'm afraid officers are not allowed to accept tips." And he said, "Well, if you don't take it, I'll give it to the first steward I see." So I thought, to hell with this, so I put it in my pocket. Unfortunately, other people saw it happen. And when I got to the wardroom at lunchtime, I wondered what was going on because there were bottles of gin and scotch all over the place. And I said, "Whose birthday are we celebrating?" And they said, "Nobody's. You're paying for it because we heard that you got $50 off Mike Todd." We went along on this inspection, and we were in the Gulf Stream, and it was very hot. And the ships in those days did not have air conditioning. And so the heat from the butchers and the bakers and things like that coming out it made it very uncomfortable. And the Queen Mother stopped and said, "Commodore, what's down that companionway there?" And he said, "Oh, the engine room ratings quarters, ma'am." And she said, "Oh, I will go down and say hello to them." Now, one must remember in those days there were 8 or 10 seamen to a cabin. And the poor fellows coming up out of the engine room were covered in oil with sweaty socks and dirty overalls and things like that. And the Commodore said, "Might I suggest not, ma'am?" And the Queen Mother looked up with a charming smile on her face and said, "Well, Commodore, it is my ship." And he looked at me and I knew exactly what he meant, so I dashed ahead, and the Commodore kept chatting for a few minutes. And I went down and I said to the boys, I said, "For Christ's sake, get some clothes on." Some of them were starkers and things like that. The Queen Mother's coming down, and they told me to go away in seaman's terms. And I said, "No, I do mean it." And it was below sea level. Only Punkaloo was blowing in air from outside. And it was hot, smelly, and extremely unpleasant. And I don't suppose the Queen Mother has ever been in a condition like that in her life. And she spent 20 minutes talking to the crew down there. And when she got off in New York, 1,200 crew on board. I don't think there was one member of the crew on duty where they should have been. They were either on the side of the ship or on the quayside cheering her. She had us eating all out of the palm of her hand. She is a magnificent woman.
I think you'll agree that Peter's got some great stories to tell, and the whole point of this exercise is to enable future generations and people who've known Peter, he says sounding a bit morbid, to enjoy them in the future.
In the long distant future.
In the long distant future, when I'm as old as Peter is now.
God, I'm as old as God.
Let our affair be a gay thing, and when these hours have flown, then without forgetting the happiness that has passed, there'll be no regretting fun that didn't quite last. Let's look on love as a plaything. All these sweet moments we've known mustn't be degraded when the thrill of them has faded.